Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer, and today we're going to have another incredible and fantastic episode for you guys. So hopefully you enjoy. Today I'm going to go into the weeds of politics, into the swamp. We're going deep into the swamp today to discuss a new breaking development from Washington, D.C. Mitch McConnell is stepping down as Senate leader, or Senate GOP leader, at the end of this year, or in November, and he will have a new successor. Who will lead the Republicans in the Senate? Who will lead the Republicans in the upper chamber? And there's already emerged three guys to serve in this position, and all three of them are named John. One is John Thune, who's a minority whip, John Barrasso, who's from Wyoming, a powerful guy in the leadership caucus, and then John Cornyn, who was minority whip for years. I think he stepped down in 2018 as minority whip, either 2016 or 2018. But he's been a powerful force in the Republican caucus since then. There's a few dark horse candidates, or really just one. I've heard rumors that Steve Daines, who's head of the National Republican Senatorial Committee, which is the campaign arm for the Republicans, the NRSC, he is also rumored to want to jump in. And so this is kind of a big. Well, it's not a kind of a big deal. This is a big deal because this could impact how Republicans operate for many years. Mitch McConnell has been Senate leader for a very long time, or leader of the Republican caucus for a very long time. And the person who succeeds him could also be in there for 10, 15 years. So you never know. So this person who they pick could shape the development of the Republican Party, not just within the Senate, but the party itself, outside of it. All four of them who are possible are establishment. There's not really a strong conservative or America First guy you would really want in there. Probably because a lot of senators who are more to the right have presidential aspirations rather than focusing on the Senate. Someone like Josh Hawley, J.D. Vance, even someone like Tom Cotton. All those guys are not, some of the people would not like some of the mentions. I mean, Tom Cotton's a huge war hawk, big time neocon, but he's pretty good domestic policy. Most of these guys want to run for president someday. They don't really want to focus on leadership in the Senate, which is different from politics in the past. In the past, the way to increase your chances for the presidency was to gain these leadership roles within the Senate and in the House. Now today, it's a sign that you're not going to be a presidential candidate if you're one of the people competing for jockeying for these jobs. I'd have to think of the last time that somebody who was a leader of one of the chambers of the caucus was Dick Gephardt, who was like a serious candidate. That was all the way back in 2004. Gephardt was leader of the Democratic caucus. I forget if he was ever House Speaker. I don't think he ever was House Speaker. And in fact, he wasn't. He was he was House Majority Leader when they still had the House, and then he lost it. And when they lost the House, he remained leader of the Democratic caucus. But he was never House Speaker. That's the last one I can really think of. I mean, Paul Ryan was suggested as a serious presidential contender, but once he became Speaker, his chances diminished. That's the last one. Most of the senators are guys who have just been in their first term and are getting a lot of press, and they're like, "Oh, this person's young, dynamic. We need to get this person in to the presidency." Barack Obama, both Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz back in 2016. Even in 2020, Biden wasn't running against the leadership of his party. He was running against like random people who were, he wasn't running against Chuck Schumer and those types. Biden himself was a pretty big leader in the Democratic Senate caucus, but I mean, he had been there for years, and he was in office for over 30 years. So obviously, he was going to have some leadership roles, but I think he was just committee chairman rather than any of the formal party leadership roles. But in the past, when they were talking about presidential candidates, and they're talking about people who would be either running mates or being ready for president themselves, a lot of them were people from the leadership. I mean, most famous example is arguably would probably be Lyndon B. Johnson, who became leader of the Democrats in the Senate in the 50s, and he used that role to elevate himself to a national stage and to getting the vice presidency and then the presidency. So that would be one of the more famous examples. And then Gerald Ford was leader of the House Republican caucus and then was elevated to the vice presidency. The big thing that people don't do this is that it's a lot easier and better for your national stature, especially among your party base, to not be in party leadership. Because party leadership, generally the base comes to hate because they make compromises, they push bills that a lot of the base hates, and it's much better for a candidate who eyes the White House to stay athwart that, to stay free of that, and to push for their own legislative agenda and their own items outside of leadership. Because leadership's main goal is to try to get bills passed or to stop bills. It's not really this type of exciting stuff where you're going on Fox News and talk radio and presenting yourself as a firebrand for the people, which is generally what you want to present yourself as if you want to run for president. So most of the guys who are probably better than these choices are focusing on how to build up their presidential aspirations for 2028 rather than focusing on this. But it's not to say that they're all terrible, but there is the whole point of this our opening subject is to highlight the worst of the possible four. And that is John Cornyn. John Cornyn is the worst Republican in Congress. Now, there are many Republicans who have worse politics than him. Lisa Murkowski, Susan Collins, obvious examples. And the House has a lot of terrible Republicans like Don Bacon and others. But none of them are in leadership positions. None of them have the power to actually accomplish the terrible ideas they want to see enacted. Cornyn has that power. Cornyn is, even compared to some of these people who are suggested for House Speaker, would be worse than them. Out of all the people who were pushed for House Speaker, who were serious, the worst was probably Tom Emmer. But he's worse than Tom Emmer. Because Cornyn would have the power to actually enact amnesty in America, which is, I think, the most important thing we want Congress to never do. Congress doesn't do much of anything now, but they can do a few terrible things. And one of those terrible things is passing an amnesty. And the fortunate thing we've had is that we've had leadership that is bent to conservative will and has not tried to pass any of this stuff. When you have McConnell's been terrible on a lot of fronts. If you want to look at why Trump was made a lot of stupid decisions during his presidency, a lot of that was McConnell coming in at the advice of McConnell, or McConnell exerting pressure on him. Like a lot of his foreign policy decisions of like the decision to halt the withdrawal from Afghanistan, that came from McConnell. And also a lot of these picks that he was making that were a little concerning, a lot of that came from McConnell. But outside of that, McConnell understood or tried to understand where the base was coming from. And if the base had a position on an issue that he could not move, and he could not move in the direction he wanted, he wouldn't push it. He would acclimate himself to that position. I mean, one good example is amnesty. McConnell was never one of the big boosters of amnesty. He voted against the Gang of Eight bill in 2013, and he never really tried to push Republicans to take up this measure afterwards. And so that's a good thing. The difference is Cornyn has been one of the leaders in Congress of trying to get Republicans on board to pass immigration reform, which of course generally means amnesty. And it's a curious factor because when they were trying to pass amnesties in the late 2000s and in 2013, he voted against these bills. And he was seen as one of the top guys against the Gang of Eight amnesty in 2013, which the Gang of Eight amnesty, a lot of people probably don't even remember this shit because you really have to be, I always forget how new people are to politics. And sometimes people forget what happened in 2016, much less 2013. And so I have to explain what Gang of Eight is. Gang of Eight amnesty was this package that was negotiated by a lot of people. It was negotiated by Marco Rubio, Lindsey Graham, Jeff Flake, most people would probably forget Jeff Flake. Jeff Flake was thought to be a historic Republican because he stood against Trump, and he delivered a fiery retirement address leaving the Senate against Trump. And people are like, this is going to go down in history, and everyone forgets Jeff Flake. I forget who the fourth Republican involved in negotiations was. I think that fourth Republican might not be there. And then there was 4 Democrats who were there, and they negotiated this package that would have given a full legalization to all illegal aliens in exchange for some modest border security. And at that time, Republicans thought this was their only hope for election success in the future, because after 2012, even though Romney did poorly among working class whites, they decided that the real message is that they need to increase their Hispanic turnout, which they had like 27% vote in 2012. And even though people had crunched numbers and shown that they would have to get over 70% of the Hispanic vote to have won in 2012 with the same number of white votes and others, that they would have had to increase it by an astronomical amount, they all thought that the real hope was to push it up to 40%. And they thought the best way to do this was amnesty. So much of conservative media was promoting this. At one point in time, Sean Hannity was talking about how we need to do immigration reform. But when the bill came out, he opposed it. Bill O'Reilly, who was the biggest conservative figurehead at this time, endorsed the amnesty when it came out. And several Republicans voted for it. It got, I think, 68 votes in the Senate. And, they had, I think Democrats had like a 53, 54, maybe 52 seat majority. It was a very narrow majority. So there was at least 15 Republicans who voted for it. And roughly 15 Republicans. And, it looked like it might pass into the House. Fortunately, it never passed in the House because Boehner, realized that all his conservative lawmakers, John Boehner, who was the House Speaker at the time, he realized like all the conservatives were up in arms about it. They thought they'd kind of wait and delay. And then the main person in the House who was pushing for this was House Majority Leader Eric Cantor, lost his primary over immigration in 2014, and that effectively killed it. So they never had to worry about Gang of 8 amnesty after the primary defeat. But at that time, every Republican and most conservative media thought that this was like the future of the party. And I just gotten involved formally in politics at that time. And all these people were just like, this is what we have to do. It's racist to oppose amnesty. And even at this time in 2013, it was still like a huge thing to oppose amnesty, much less wanting immigration restriction in general. And so anyone who was opposing amnesty was seen as awesome. John Cornyn was one of those guys who was strongly against the Gang of 8 when it came out in 2013. Some of this reason may have been because he was worried about a Tea Party challenger in 2014. He was up for re-election in 2014. And a lot of these guys, the Tea Party had been knocking off a lot of, senators and congressmen who were powerful in the years leading up to 2014. And so this was a legitimate worry. And so maybe he felt that he had to really lead the campaign against it in order to secure his position in the Senate. And he was minority whip at the time. So he led the fight against it and probably ensured that, a majority of Republicans didn't go for amnesty, fortunately. And this establishes bona fides. He easily won his primary in 2014. The Tea Party really fizzled out in 2014 in that the only successful primary challenge they had, or person that they really backed or was a Tea Party guy, was Dave Brad against Eric Cantor. And that was the one guy they didn't highlight at all or didn't fund for. And he was the only one who won. Every other Tea Party candidate or their guy in a primary race lost that year. And so the Tea Party really fizzled out after 2014. But this is, the year early 2013, this is a very legitimate fear for establishment Republicans. But ever since then, he has been the guy to demand Republicans take immigration reform seriously. Throughout the Trump years, he wanted an amnesty for dreamers, the illegal aliens who came to the U.S. as minors. He's also been a big refugee supporter and a big supporter of guest workers. And even in Trump years, he kept advocating for this. He's like, we need to get this done. He said his biggest regret during his time in the Senate was not getting immigration reform, read amnesty, through the Senate, through Congress. And then when, Biden came in, he tried to push another, a mild amnesty just for those who had been covered by DACA. And fortunately, Democrats didn't think it was enough, so it failed. But he's been eager for this. And he's even said at times since 2021 that he really wants to try immigration. He really wants to do this. And he's made really other terrible compromises outside of immigration. He was the guy who pushed the red flag gun laws in the Senate, these gun control measures that were, in some ways rather toothless, but it was a sign of them doing something. And it was a sign that Cornyn may be open to more extreme restrictions on guns if he got a little bit more power. So that's one. He's also been a huge hawk. He's always talked about how we need to do everything possible for Ukraine. He was even on the trip to visit Ukraine. I think that was back in 2022. And he's like, defense policy uber alles with him. He's been that. Also, probably his worst thing is he helped make Juneteenth a national holiday, and he attacked any Republicans or conservatives who were not down with the holiday to support reparations. So yeah, he is uniquely terrible in that he has the ability to make things happen. Is that a lot of Republicans will advocate for, there's not a lot who will advocate for amnesty. There are a lot who will advocate for doing more to help outreach to blacks or something. But very few of them, or really none of them, have the power to make this happen. Cornyn has shown time and time again he has the power to make it happen. And if he became Senate Majority Leader or Senate Minority Leader, Republicans should win the Senate in the 2024 election. It has to be a catastrophic election if they somehow do not win back the Senate. I'm actually changing I'm more confident that Trump is actually also going to win the 2024 election. So when I said most likely circumstance for Republicans is that they win back the Senate, second most likely is Trump wins, and then third, which is the least likely to happen, is that they maintain control of the House. But I think in any scenario, even if Trump loses, they're going to win the Senate. But I'm more confident that Trump's going to win because it doesn't look like he's going to be convicted of any serious crimes before November. So that's a major white pill. But going back to the topic at hand, if he's Senate Majority Leader, and let's say Trump loses, I would say it is an incredibly high probability he tries to do a grand immigration bargain with Biden. And that is the absolute last thing we want Republicans to do. And if Republicans lose the House, Hakeem Jeffries is Speaker of the House, Republicans can pass some, he can get his, I guess Schumer would still be majority leader or leader of the Democratic caucus. Schumer and Cornyn can hash out some idea, and then there's no Republican speaker to prevent this bill from being reached, and, we could have amnesty in America. And I would say that is one of the most likely things to happen if Cornyn is Senate Majority Leader and if Biden loses. Now, if Trump wins, his ability to do harm is greatly limited. And Trump really does not like Cornyn. Trump World is advocating against Cornyn. Cornyn has criticized Trump before publicly. He even opposed when Trump in 2019 wanted to get funding for border security. He diverted Defense Department money to the border, which obviously is defending the homeland, but Cornyn wasn't a fan of that and criticized it. And he was also very critical of a border wall. So it's Trump World coming out against him. It's various figures who definitely have ties to Donald Trump who are attacking him on Twitter and elsewhere. Ken Paxton, who is Attorney General of Texas, good ties with Trump. A lot of conservatives like him have criticized and said we don't want Cornyn, and Cornyn says that you'll be in jail. There are rumors that Paxton may try to primary Cornyn. I don't know if that's the best idea for Paxton, but he's also criticizing him. There's going to be a build up to saying, like, we don't want Cornyn at all among conservatives and among Trump world. And I guarantee you that Trump will probably try to intervene. They are telling him to not intervene. Like, the Senate's like, please don't do that, Mr. Trump. Please let us pick. But he probably is going to intervene anyway. He has a little bit of a tense relationship with John Thune, but John Thune endorsed him in the primary pretty early on, or fairly early on. I think it was before the primary started, or may have just been after Iowa. Barrasso endorsed him. Barrasso has also been going out and campaigning for Carrie Lake in order to try to win over MAGA world. He did a whole interview with Carrie Lake, which he is building up a good relationship there. That is important to get Trump to world to not hate him. Daines has a good relationship with Trump too. I think he may have been a very early endorsement of Trump. And he was. He endorsed him back in April of 2023 when everyone thought that Ron DeSantis was going to dominate the primary. So the early nature of his endorsement definitely, if he decides to run, will definitely help him in Trump's eyes. But so I don't think he may criticize Thune, but I don't think he would have any problems with Barrasso and Daines. And if he probably had a favorite, it'd probably be Daines. I think Daines has done the most work to make himself appealing to Trump. And Daines has also been very smart. Daines came out very publicly against the recent border bill deal that was terrible and was going to essentially not do anything about the crisis and was going to legalize through backdoor means all these illegals who've come to this country. Daines publicly opposed it. And Cornyn also, when it finally was released, said, oh, I have problems with this bill. But Daines really just had a tweet as like, this is a terrible bill. We should never have this, which definitely earned a lot of support from conservatives. So if I had to say who is best, I'd probably say either Daines or Barrasso. Thune is a little bit too much of a empty suit. I don't know. Thune is... I feel like he is not as strong of a leader. I think he's just kind of there because he's like a yes man. As minority whip, I don't think he's like a very dynamic leader. We already have these problems with Johnson where they're just like, okay, no one has a problem with this guy. And they pick Mike Johnson and he's proving to be a very weak leader. And as House Speaker, and he always looks like he's like well above his pay grade at this role. But they all just picked him because no one had a real problem with him. I feel like that might be the same way with Thune. He would still be better than Cornyn, but I would have to say either Barrasso or Daines. But it's really just no one, absolutely not Cornyn. Cornyn would be terrible. And if Biden wins, and Democrats win the House, there is a very good chance they're going to pass amnesty. There were fears of this in 2020 after 2020, but Democrats had a very, very thin majority, bare majority, 1 vote majority in the Senate, and they had a very small majority in the House, and they couldn't get and all Republicans were lined up against amnesty when they tried to push this. When you would have your leader of your caucus saying, let's do amnesty, that makes it much more likely it can get passed through. Now, there might not be enough Republicans to support such a measure to overcome a filibuster. So that might be the only thing to stop it. But if you had the House in Democrat control, and it got to the House, it would pass. With Hakeem Jeffries at the helm. So that's the real reason why you don't want him there. And even if he was there under Trump, he would be opposing Trump. He'd be giving him terrible advice. He would not be down for the America First agenda, while pretty much all the other 3 candidates would just be much more pro-Trump, much more in line with the agenda that the president wants to pass, while Cornyn would have his own agenda he wants to pass and would try to thwart the president's agenda. So that's why Cornyn would be the worst Republican in Congress, is that he is not as terrible as some of the others, but he has the power to make these terrible ideas reality and make them law. And to keep him from obtaining more power is very important for conservatives and the right at this moment. And so that's why you do not want Cornyn at all and the Senate Majority Leader, our Senate GOP Senate Leader. So that is my views on Cornyn and that race. So the second topic I want to discuss before we get to the conflict questions is Trump's usage terms he's using for his enemies. And it's interesting, a term he's starting to use a lot now, and that is fascist. And he's also using the term communist as well, which is pretty of a new thing. I don't remember him when he was president or running for president in 2016 ever using fascist and communist. But now he's using it very frequently to describe the Democrats and Biden. And I don't think anyone would have much of a problem with communists. But obviously, some on the right would be like, "Oh, don't please use fascist. That's a left-wing thing," and so some might have a problem with that. So I want to go into a little bit about describing this for the reasons why Trump uses it, its the resonance of these terms in American society, and whether they're relevant to what we're dealing with now. So the one thing to realize is that why Trump uses this is that this is probably contrary to a lot of what the dissident right thinks of American people want. American people actually really don't like authoritarianism or control over their lives. You know, some may say, oh, that's just the libtards and stuff. But even if you look at what right-wingers really animates them over the last few years, you know, the main thing that they really hated was the dictatorship of the mandates and lockdowns. They hated how it was eliminating their freedom. And even though some of these guys who may have really criticized it would be like, we need a more authoritarian government and to eliminate civil liberties and stuff, but they would still, you know, have a huge problem with having the government come down and tell them that they have to take a shot, whether they have to wear a mask out in public, whether they're able to open their business. You know, they really did not like government coming down and suppressing their freedoms in that. And it's the same you could see about Republican or right-wing concerns about free speech and right-wing concerns about, government coming into local schools and mandating they must teach certain subjects. And so you really see that I feel like this is something that a lot of the dissident right misses, is how important the idea of liberty is to people. And people may, roll their eyes and say, "Oh, that's just propaganda and stuff." And no, it's actually a very important concept to Americans, is their liberty to live their lives the way they see fit. Now, there's problems with that because a lot of people become so hyper individualistic that they forget the bigger problems. They just focus on what's in their front lawn and what's in their own property, and everything outside of it, they just don't care about. But at the same time, this is a uniquely American characteristic. And the idea of fascism or communism, which in most Americans don't have a deep understanding of this, but they just think tyrannical, dictatorship, trying to run my life, trying to tell me what to do, trying to take away my liberties. And that is a message that resonates with them. And that's why Trump uses it, because if you're going out there, and even though Trump does make jokes about how he's going to be a dictator on day one and stuff, but when his real appeal is like, I'm going to make you guys more free and have more liberties to do what you say, and they're not going to try to take away your business, and look at what they're trying to do to me. They're arresting all these political prisoners and this terrible stuff. It's appealing to deeply ingrained American sentiments and values with that. And so that's why he deploys fascist and communist, because if you came out there and was like, I'm a proud fascist, it's like saying you're a proud Satanist to people. It's just immediately there's a negative connotation to that. It's immediately that there are people like, you're just simply coming out and saying, I'm the bad guy. I'm a bad guy from a movie. I want to take away your freedoms and liberty. And so most people are not going to be enthused by that. Now, of course, some people on the internet might like that message, but people on the internet are not real life people. And that is not the majority of people. And so that's why Trump appeals to it. And you could say, oh, he should use communist or whatever. But fascist has most like I was going to say for better or for worse, but most likely for worse because it's completely dilutes the meaning of what fascism is and creates obsession around World War II and all other things. But in American society, fascist has a much deeper resonance or a much bigger scare factor than communist. I feel like if you're talking about communist, people feel like that's in the past. Even though obviously fascism is far more in the past than communism, people have, through media, through movies, through video games, through political discourse, have been made to fear that fascism is just around the corner and we must do everything to protest against it. And the fact that liberals have been calling Trump a fascist for years and years is that now he's trying to do a bit of political judo and say, actually, no, you're the real fascist. And the same way that Republicans have been saying Democrats are the real racists. I do think there's a little bit, it's not my term I would use, but I think there's a little bit more there than saying Democrats are the real racist, because in people's minds when they think fascist is just somebody who's taking away my freedoms and liberty, and that's what Democrats want to do, and that's what they're doing against Trump as well. They're trying to take away all his money just because of him running for president and his political views, and that's very un-American. So that's why he uses it, and it still has a bit of resonance. Now, a lot of the right prefers the term communist. You do see this term coming back a lot more. There's a book that came out by Jesse Kelly, I think last year, called The Anti-Communist Manifesto. I would not read that book. Jesse Kelly's one of the dumbest people in politics, and I can only imagine how stupid the book is. I already have to... Well, I've been blocked for over a year by him, just because he kept subtweeting my anti-national divorce piece, and I responded once to him, and then he blocked me. A very common Greer problem. Apparently I didn't have the intelligence to understand his national divorce case, but now I can understand it because I can't see it. But he, wrote this book. I'm sure it's very stupid, and how that the communists are still around. And a lot of people are kind of making this up. I think it's in response to the left, believing MAGA and other right-wingers are the new Nazis, and using these terms that are very loaded in our society that are just like, well, we're going to flip the table and say, you're actually the communist. But as I was alluding to earlier, communist just does not have the type of power that fascist or Nazi has in our society. And we can argue all day that, well, it should, but it doesn't. And I think with a lot of people, since that term was so prevalent in the minds of people who grew up in the Cold War, they view it as something of the past. Is that something that's been buried? And I think in a lot of ways they're right. Because, Soviet Union fell. They don't have a replacement for the Soviet Union. The Chinese communists aren't really communists anymore. It's hard to find a communist state. There's still socialist states. There's still states that have massive redistribution of wealth, like Venezuela, Cuba, a few others. There's states that have virtually no freedom, like North Korea. There are these states that you can be called communist, and maybe you use a little bit of hyperbolic rhetoric to go from socialist to communist. So there's still that, but in terms of the international communist menace in the way that it was for the Cold War, that's just not there. And so people feel like you're talking about, going and buying VHS tapes or something. They view, if you're saying communism, it's just something that they think is in the past and it's no longer relevant. And the term they're using it for is like these centrist libs who are just as devoted to the capitalist system as Republicans. Now, of course, they want more taxes, and they do entertain wealth redistribution more than Republicans, but it's not really communism. Socialism, for whatever reason, socialism, which was probably a little bit more accurate, has been ditched in favor of just communism, which maybe is just like a sign of just how radicalizing the right-wing rhetoric can be in our society. I don't know if radicalizing is the best way. Making it more entertaining and exciting and titillating is to say communist rather than socialism sucks. But yeah, I don't think it's a very persuasive rhetorical tool. It's whatever. Trump says it, I'm for it, but I don't think it's very persuasive case. But we don't really have, people don't want to say dictator or tyrants. It's much better to say fascist or communist now and just say that they're aiming for your liberties and freedom. But we're not really dealing with communists. It'd be much better if we were dealing with a more far left extreme movement than what we're dealing with now, which is what I've argued in my piece last year, talking about American Chauvinism, where you have the possibility that there could be this emergence of a openly anti-white Bernie Sanders style movement in American politics, and it could have the possibility of gaining power. And if you had that possibility, it would have a radicalizing effect on the right and normie America, and over the fear that these people could be taking away their stuff and could make their life far worse. But what we really have is Biden. Biden sucks, but I mean, looking at most of these liberals, they don't make for the type of terrifying opponent that you need to have the correct the radicalizing effect among normie mainstream Americans. And so it would be a lot better if we were actually arguing against communists, but we're not. And the most that they have is like the CCP with China, which really kind of makes right-wing Americans more on board with the empire and the establishment, a little bit more with China, because they're all worried about what China may do. And obviously everyone hates China, but it doesn't make for the type of compelling enemy that the Soviet Union was. It is more Americans do see China as a threat than they did in the early 2010s, or even really pre-Trump. This is kind of the Trump effect, because a ton of people made fun of Trump for talking about China. China is our number one enemy, which people just made fun of that. And now even libtards think that China is the number one enemy. I mean, this is a shared assumption among both Biden and Trump that China is our number one geopolitical foe. But it doesn't make for the type of compelling enemy that the Soviet Union and communism did for the Cold War. And conservatives, during the Cold War, were able to form and have a coherent political movement over this shared opposition to communism. And right now, we can't really figure out a shared enemy for all the Big Ten of the right, except for wokeness. And wokeness isn't really well defined like communism is. They try to make it with the China. That sort of works, but China is just not as the fear and threat of China does not press on people's day-to-day lives like the Soviet Union did in the 50s and 60s. So that doesn't really work. You really just come down to wokeness, which is rather undefined, much less defined than communism is. And so we do go back to the old playbook and bring out these terms we've used in the Cold War to warn about the libtard dictatorship, which they do work in some ways, because I do think there's a grain of truth to them, that the Democrats want to take away your freedom and liberty and make your life suck and take away your money. But it doesn't have that as much of a radicalizing effect on our constituents and among mainstream independent Americans as we would think, as communism did. Red Scare, both in the 1920s, got passage of the Immigration Act in 1924. And then Red Scare in the 40s and 50s made America much more right-wing in the 50s. Obviously, that went away in the 60s, but it did have a kind of strong reactionary force in the 50s where, it animated continued support for immigration restriction, which a lot of people, there was establishment types who wanted to have more liberal immigration policies, but they're like, this is going to allow all these communists in. It also animated both integration and segregation. Both sides in the argument were, integrationists were like, we have to do this in order to defeat Soviet Union and to show the rest of the world we're better than the Soviets. And then the segregationists were saying, actually, this is a communist plot to transform America. And I think that did have an appeal to a lot of Americans, and that it was a left-wing scheme to radically transform the country. So when you do have that radical left-wing force there, it's better for the right. But I think we struggle to have to have that illustrated when our foes are Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden, which suck. They do suck, but they're not quite the communists that we imagine. I am going to write an article about this at some point about who's the right's enemy or how the right defines itself against this grand enemy and the use of communists at some point. Not this week, but at some point. So be on the lookout for that. And so now we're up for our COD of Elite questions. We've got a lot of COD of Elite questions today. So as a reminder, you too can get the power to ask me questions or suggest guests and topics if you sign up for the COD of Elite option at Highly Respected's Substack. And that's at highly-respected.com. And make sure to sign up for the IQ supplements while you're there. So I'm going to start with two questions because two different people asked about the same issue this week. And let me find it. So both John Chandler and New England Refugee asked about the debt. It was also a very similar question to both of them. I will just read, they both asked a similar question and both were framed in the same way. I'm just going to read John Chandler's question. I will add our New England Refugees question to it. And so John asks, my question this week is about our $34 trillion debt. I know our side on the right often rolls its eyes when discussions about this comes up, as it reminds one of the more fringe elements of the GOP that existed before Trump. However, given America's third world demographic and cultural trends and geopolitics taking shape around the world, I cannot imagine this will end well unless something changes. I'll even admit it's starting to bother me so much that I often worry how it might affect my own investments, financial situation, and that of everyone around me. Granted, there are many factors affecting this issue, but curious to hear your thoughts and how you think our side should approach this topic. And it is true. It was a very GOP Inc. question that we had prior to Trump, and it was, alt-right at that time liked to make fun of it. And they did have these college kids with a debt clock, which at that time was like 19 trillion. Now it's almost nearly doubled since then. In the early 2010s, it wasn't very effective, but this was like the key issue. I'll read New England Refugees' take on this. He's saying our interest payments on the national debt will be our biggest expense by 2030. I understand that many think this doesn't matter and that we can keep going forever, but at some point people will not buy our debt because they don't believe we will pay it back. How do you think we will fix this? Cutting spending on programs, inflating the currency, massive tax increases, or just straight defaulting? My bet is inflation because it hurts the wealthy with assets the least. It'll probably, to go to his question, I think it's most likely going to be inflation. All these are painful aspects, but the most painful aspect is cutting programs. And it's very politically unpopular to address this issue because what would happen to deal with the debt is to have entitlement reforms. And entitlement reforms are the best way to lose an election. Anyone who champions entitlement reforms is not going to win. If you're even any mild changes to Social Security or Medicare, anything of that sort, it would have a tremendous negative effect for the party championing it. I used to be opposed to entitlement reforms, and I still am for pragmatic reasons because I know that it will just destroy the Republicans if they are for this. So I like when Trump says, we're definitely not going to cut your Social Security. Smart politics. But at the end of the day, we actually do need to do some type of entitlement reform to help us. And it's not just simply for cuck reasons or just the economy, is it would lower the demand for immigration because they always say, we need immigrants to keep paying into Social Security. If you make entitlement reforms, it would reduce the pressure in these stupid arguments that we need immigrants to pay. I mean, a lot of these immigrants pay hardly anything into Social Security anyway. But make those changes, make Social Security more stable and more likely to be there for when we're in our 60s and 70s, then you would have less of a need for immigration. So there is a identitarian aspect to entitlement reform as well. And I think my support for it is just not we're going to privatize it or something. It just raise the age to 68 or 67. Do something very mild like that. That's all. But even doing something like that is very politically unpopular. I mean, Europe is, I mean, Macron has been trying to do that in France, and it set off riots and turned the public against him, has made him unpopular. Anywhere where they do it is just a very unpopular decision. And considering that all politicians care about is getting reelected, they're less inclined to do this. So that's the unfortunate factor. So instead of spending cuts or raising taxes, both which will impact the lawmakers in Congress, we're instead just going to kick the to inflation, which is something the Fed will deal with, and the president. And yeah, I mean, inflation's also unpopular as well. But you can just say, oh, it's the market. It's the Fed, and so they'll just blame somebody else. That's an appointed, an unelected bureaucrat who's doing that rather than your representative. So that's more the politically safe option for this. But it is going to be a problem if American economy ever stagnated and the debt began to far outstrip our GDP, because then that would have massive economic effects. But for right now, despite all of America's problems, America's economy is still the dominant force in the world. A lot of it, China's economic growth is starting to slow down. It is not as quite as impressive as it once was. Europe is crumbling. The economy is crumbling. I mean, Germany's economy is really tanking. And so America's just like, woo, we're even more economically successful, and even more of the world is still economically dependent on us. I mean, I don't think they're ever going to de-dollarize most of the global economy for the near future and stuff. So a lot of these effects, we can just keep printing money and keep doing the same things we are, as long as we maintain the preeminent power and economic dominance around the world. Because no one's going to come and collect the debt on us. They're not going to. It's like when the rest of the world is doing as worse than us in economic matters, it makes America's debt, just something that they can kick the can down another day. But it is like a major problem. And, if we do get in another war, and I mean, the Ukraine war is adding to our debt. I mean, we're spending billions and billions of dollars on this. It's not even our war. That's adding to the debt effect. But one of the things about being the preeminent global power is that we have to spend a lot of money. And for a lot of these Republicans who will worry about the debt and we're spending too much money, we're leaving our grandkids with a massive debt. They'll still be like, oh, $50 billion for Ukraine? Absolutely. They won't think about this stuff. And they all won't actually be very serious about spending cuts. And Congress is just not going to do anything. I made this argument in a podcast a few weeks ago, but Congress is just not going to do anything for serious. I mean, I did, at the beginning of this podcast, I did say they may pass amnesty. There are a few things like that, but in terms of and that's a major, major thing. But the chances of that, while I do say they greatly increase under Cornyn, there's still a lot of hurdles to doing that. But the type of transformational change of something like Obamacare, which passed in 2010, are far less likely now. You're not going to see Congress have transformational change. Now, that is good in some ways when it comes to immigration. Mostly immigration. If Congress was ever going to pass anything on immigration, it would be something we'd hated, such as amnesty. It also means stuff like the justice for George Floyd and the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which for some reason Biden brought up again. Which I'm like, you this had to be saved in drafts, because your party does not want to run on reminding Americans that they were all for handcuffing police and defunding the police and siding with criminals. That proved to be a political loser. But Biden's like, oh, we need to bring that back. That's unlikely to happen. These really important changes to healthcare and government spending and Social Security, you're just not going to see Congress do that. One, they can't reach any agreement. It's very hard for a party to have an overwhelming majority like Obama did in his first term. That stuff is just not going to be the case anymore. You're going to have very thin majorities on either side that pass back and forth All these guys do not want to make major sacrifices that would jeopardize them having a seat in Congress to pass these reforms. And when it comes to the debt, they just think it's never going to be a problem. No one's ever going to collect the bill, and we can just keep spending, and who cares? And it's not like voters would instead punish them for trying to do something about it rather than reward them. And voters reward them for kicking the can down the road while they'll punish them for not. So I guess it's just how American democracy works. But I think it is a serious problem. In the next decade, it's hard to predict what things are going to happen in the next decade. But having a massive debt, it could be, massively increased from 19 trillion to 34 trillion in, roughly a decade. By 2035, it could be 50 trillion. Maybe even sooner, it could be 50 trillion if we keep, find another war we want to spend money on. So, and this is a major problem because, we can't bank on American economic dominance in the same way we have now till the end of time. So eventually this is going to be a massive problem for America. But the issue is you really can't hope for Congress to solve this. I don't know what would happen. Maybe you would have a president who he's in his final term and he does executive orders to cut some of these things, or he makes a budget where he's the one blamed for this that has massive spending cuts, and Congress will sign on to it under the belief that they won't be the ones punished for it. How that'll work, I don't know. That's generally not how politics works, but some weird things could happen like that. American democracy at the point that it is now, due to the fact of how high political polarization is between Republicans and Democrats, they are not likely to sign on to any bills that will ensure they lose their seats and the other side won't. And voters really don't care about this. American people would rather have a massive debt that doesn't require any sacrifices on their part versus dealing with the debt that requires sacrifices on their part. A big thing you have to remember about America is that Americans hate when the government takes away something from them. We're like kids with toys. It can be, government's like, oh, you're used to having abortion. Well, we're taking away that toy. And then we start crying like, no, we want abortion back. That's what we've been given. Or prohibition of some sort. We're taking away the alcohol. Then we cry, we're upset about this, and we get alcohol back. And it can even be the same with Social Security. If people have this understanding in their mind that Social Security is there when they turn 65, they'll eventually get those payments. And then if the government takes that away, people get mad and they start crying and they want it back. It's even the same with the attempts to eliminate Obamacare. Even though it sucked, it hurt the healthcare system, people got used to it, and they had this perception that by taking it away, they're taking away something that has been given to them, and they hate the idea of the government. Once the government gives people something, it is insanely hard to take it away from them. It is insanely hard to convince them that they have to give it up. They don't want to give sacrifices. The whole point about America is that you have no real duties for citizenship. It's all just rights and privileges. And this is one of the real problems with marijuana legalization. Once it's legalized, it's going to be very hard to get rid of it, to criminalize it, because people are just going to be under the assumption that that's going to be there. And even if they're not smoking weed, they just think, well, we've been given this right. How dare you take it away from us? It's the same with birth control and all the matters that deal with abortion. It's why IVF is the idea that they may ban IVF is so wildly unpopular. Once the American people are given something, it is very hard to take away. And that's why politicians are motivated to do nothing about spending in the debt and just let it happen, and we'll just worry about it for another day, because that's what's politically popular. Now we're going to go on to dollar bills. So that answer both future American refugee, I always want to call them future American refugee, New England refugee. We've got a lot of refugees who ask. New England refugee and John Chandler answer both her question. We'll conclude with K-Max today. So Dollar Bill asks, would you ever do an IQ supplement on Harold Covington and his Northwest Front novels? To recap, Covington was a boomer white nationalist who joined the U.S. military for a time. That might not be. He has a weird military record. Served or claimed to have served in the Rhodesian military before being kicked out for being too extreme in his views. Spent some time in the UK and Ireland before settling in Washington State. Covington's gimmick was advocating for an ethno-state consisting of Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. He called the Northwest Republic and penned no less than 5 novels depicting a world where this country wins its independence through an IRA-style insurgency campaign and fights off American attempts to reconquer it. At one point, Amazon would happily sell you these books in both paperback and Kindle formats. Covington hosted a podcast called Radio Free Northwest, in which he gave his political commentary interspersed with musical breaks of Irish fiddle music. He ultimately died in poverty in 2018. I've read some of Covington's novels, and they are fan fiction quality literature at best. I think an IQ supplement on him would be good content, since Covington was a colorful character, and it would dovetail with your previous episodes, critiquing these WN 1.0 people, as well as the flaws of separatism and ethno-states as solutions for the problems facing the right. I don't know if I would ever do one on him, because I don't want to read those books. They're not very good books. Okay, and Covington himself was a very kind of loathsome individual. He did kind of make up his military service and other things, and it was just like really stupid. One critique I heard was like the revolution literally starts in a trailer park, and it starts over like I think some guy fucking the other dude's wife or something of some sort. It's like very Jerry Springer-esque. I mean, it's almost an ICP-esque at what you would see now, and that's what starts off the revolution. I don't really have any tolerance for it, but there is probably something there to cover like these novels that I think there is, because it's not just like the WN stuff about like Turner Diaries and stuff, but both Ben Shapiro and Kurt Schlichter have written mainstream conservative Turner Diary novel works where they're like, instead of fighting for the white ethno-state, they're fighting for low taxes and conservative values. And this idea of just like a lone man leading a revolution against the government is a pervasive idea on the right. It's been the Birch Society had similar books that they were promoting in the 50s and 60s, and it's something that's a very Cold War attitude. I mean, and it goes even to something like Red Dawn, which even though it's not fighting against the government, it's fighting against Soviet occupation. That's even part of it. And a lot of these white nationalists absolutely loved Red Dawn. They would watch it endlessly in their compounds back in the 80s. As they all thought that's what they're going to do, which is not going to happen. There's something there. I don't really want to read the Covington novels. I don't really want to read the Turner Diaries either. A lot of this stuff is very stupid, but I could cover... there might be some book or some articles about the revolutionary fantasy among the right and where it leads to, and I could incorporate some of the Covington and Pierce and Shapiro and Schlichter into that. So that would be probably what I would cover rather than actually reading the books. I don't want to torture my audience with these books. So the next question will go from New Guy Kingslander, which I unfortunately missed his questions before because they went to spam, but he's now got a new question. He said, Scott, as you said in your most recent Substack, Trump has done a good job of picking up the working class downscale white vote at the expense of losing the educated suburban white vote. Why is it that Trump in particular seems to turn off college-educated whites as opposed to previous presidents, most notably George W. Bush? The 2000s were packed full of liberal hysterics about the global war on terror, Bush being supposedly stupid, and mass panic about Saturday morning cartoon villain depictions of evangelical Christians taking over the White House. Why were middle-class whites less status afflicted by these attacks on Bush as opposed to Trump? Is it because Trump leans into his own caricature while GWB conducted himself as more respectable president, or has a rise in female self-determinism and voting behavior changed the way middle-class whites are affected by the behavior of the Republican Party? There's a few things to consider here. It's like, one, middle-class whites at that time, mostly younger, would have been Gen X. Very early millennials. And for a lot of them, if they're college educated, they think the Republican Party as just tax cuts. And they may have been put off by some of the anti-gay marriage stuff, but they're like, look, really all they focus on is business stuff. And the Democrats want to tax us more or whatever. Now, a lot of the demographic voted for Obama. Millennials at that time, if they were able to vote, I was not able to vote in 2008, believe it or not. I was a little bit young, too young. I was my senior year of high school, which might be make how old I am now. But they, millennials turned out, college students turned out overwhelmingly for Obama. So there were young people who were there, but prior to Trump, it was just seen as if you don't like taxes, you vote for the Republicans. If you like social justice or whatever, you vote for Democrats. Or if you like hope and change, you vote for Democrats. So, and more of the established college-educated whites in the suburbs would have been older. I mean, if you were in your 40s in 2004, you would be a boomer. You would be a boomer, and now those people are heading to retirement. And so it's just a very different demographic of who are now the, people 30s to 50s in the suburbs. It's a very different age demographic now. Now, Gen Xers are turning more conservative as they age. Millennials are not. And a lot of those who are college educated are voting for Democrat. And also, people 20, 30 years ago were marrying earlier and actually getting married, which marriage is, especially for women, is a good sign that they're going to be voting Republican. If they're unmarried, they're most likely going to be voting Democrat. There has been a little bit of a shift among married women towards Democrats, but it's still married college-educated women. I'd have to see the exact data. Married white women in general are vote Republican. I think it's a little more half and half for college-educated white women, but for unmarried women, white women, it's overwhelmingly pro-Democrat. And that's a much bigger cohort of unmarried whites who are in their 30s and 40s now, and they stay voting Democrat. So there are these big social changes that are happening that, how millennial political attitudes are very different from Gen Xers. Gen Xers were starting to turn to the right in the 2000s, as they age, like boomers and every other generation before them. Millennials aren't having that shift. Some of that is due to not getting married. Some of that is just ingrained with millennials. So you're not seeing that major change in a lot, and that effect is most apparent among college-educated whites. Now with Trump, I think it's also that Trump became much more of a demon or devil in the media and popular culture than Bush was. I mean, Bush, there was a lot of criticism of Bush, a lot of hate for Bush in the 2000s, but it wasn't quite the level of Trump. Or Trump hate was just even, was Bush hate on steroids. And it was just extremely common. And it was really appealing to middle-class whites and saying that, like, Trump is just so beneath you. He's low status. He's a clown. Look at his audience. You don't want to be associated with that. And I think it appealed a lot to middle-class white anxiety, status anxiety, and that made them not want to vote for Trump. And the party has just changed a lot of its image. I mean, the GOP of the Bush years was like a country club party. It was like you're out in polo shirt in public. This is what the Republican Party is like. Now it is you are out in a MAGA flag t-shirt and you're out trying to stop the steal. That is the Republican image now. And I think for status conscious upper and middle class whites, they don't want to be associated with that, which, we can, I think that's a wrong decision. They're literally voting against their own economic interests. They used to complain, Democrats used to complain that working class whites were voting against their own interests by voting Republican. I think that was a dubious argument. But for middle class whites, they are absolutely voting against their economic interests by voting for Democrats, but they'll vote for them anyway due to the status pressure and cultural pressure that's out there. So I would say it's two. It's larger social changes where there are more unmarried individuals, especially college-educated individuals, at a much higher age. There's much more unmarried people now than there were in the 2000s and the 90s. And marriage and family formation is generally one of the signs of moving further to the right and voting Republican. Now you don't have that as much, and also there's way more women not getting married, and that is an overwhelmingly Democrat-friendly demographic. And then there's some of the pressure or some of the imagery of the Republican Party and where it stands in the public consciousness is very different than what it was in the 2000s. I mean, Bush GOP was terrible, but it had a clean-cut, respectable image, and it was advocating for terrible policies, but for middle-class whites, they're like, oh, well, I'll vote for my economic interests, and the GOP was representing it. Now they're like, I'm going to vote against my economic interests just to counter-signal Trump's fascism and his proletarian values and culture. And now I'm going to move on to other questions. I said I'm going to end with K-Max, but I'm going to bring him up here. We've got a few more questions after him, but I'm going to bring him up here because he had a similar question to this. K-Max is like asking about the woman question. With Lauren Boebert and Marjorie Taylor Greene as the representatives in Congress of our views, and many commentators filling the void on the right, such as Tommy Lauren or Brett Cooper, is the issue not so much that these are women, but that they fill an insane clown party vibe, more hired for their looks and sex appeal over substance and intellectual ideas? Is your view, Scott, that the phenomenon has anything to do with right-wing women we have in politics? Sex appeal over substance, or does the insane clown party have nothing to do with women in politics? I don't think the women in politics, Boebert herself and Marjorie Taylor Greene, I do think are very off-putting people to a lot of Americans. I don't think Tommy Lauren or Brett Cooper are, especially not with Brett Cooper, even though I find her content stupid. There is a certain female demographic that really likes Brett Cooper, and that appeals to. I'm clearly not that demographic, but it's they feel I wouldn't say Tommy Lauren or Brett Cooper or ICP. Boebert and MTG definitely are. And whether this is winning over women, with the women in right-wing politics, I think it's a lot about sex appeal and looks. I think that's one thing that maybe appealing to a male demographic it wins over. Some of these women do have a trouble winning over the female voters, and a lot of these women who are just like all about like, I'm a conservative woman, I'm that, and they're like, I don't like Trump's attitudes, and also I'm very anti-racist, and I can't believe these Republicans are making jokes, racist jokes. There was this one woman, Megan Basham, I think is her name, who has inserted herself as Mr. Base Commentator, Mrs. Base Commentator, almost called her Mr. Mrs. Base Commentator, who's like, oh, I'm really right-wing radical. And she had a whole like angry tweet about how people were posting like some Asian joke. And she's like, I didn't sign up for this. We need to stop this. All the women in commentary generally want to end our fun and want their whole ideology based around themselves and their narrow concerns. That is probably a bigger problem, and we're not even winning over women with them. We're winning over their narrow subsection, and also the women are the most like aggressive conservative women and pushing these ideas that are very unappealing to other women, but it's very appealing to their own little narrow cohort, such as banning birth control, IVF, genetic testing, total abortion ban, which ensures that young women who would otherwise not vote will turn out to vote, and they will vote Democrat. A lot of these women are driving that. But that's like two different things. I mean, MTG and Boebert are clowns. The female conservative commentary are generally just pushing the right in a direction that I think is, one, not in an identitarian direction. They're generally very anti-identitarianism, even if they claim to be based or keyed or whatever. None of them claim to be keyed, but they all try to claim to be based. They also demand, they're like, well, my friends are into this idea, so this is how to win over young women. So they'll have conservative commentators who should know better, who will be openly like the Republicans need to adopt a banning the pill as part of their platform. And like, if you want to ensure the Republicans lose elections, you should do that. I mean, people can support that idea or whatever, but you have to be politically pragmatic, and that is just a guaranteed way to lose elections, is to banning the pill. But these women commentators have that, so I wouldn't. It's a little bit of an outside the ICP factor with the women in politics. There are a few female commentators in Republican politics who definitely are ICP. Tommy Lauren's actually different. I don't want to put Tommy, because Tommy Lauren's one of the few women who will. And she's been attacked for this for obvious reasons. She's been considered pro-choice compared to other Republicans and conservatives, but she's like the only woman who does that. The rest of them are like, we need to ban, banning abortion just to start, which is Republicans wonder why they don't have as good of election results. So yeah, I don't want to say that that's like really contributing to ICP. I think it's just the Republicans themselves and a lot of conservatives in the conservative movement are just such massive simps that they love elevating these women to influential positions that they shouldn't be, and then they'll treat them as serious commentators when they're in fact not very serious at all, and they're just there because they're okay looking. A lot of the women that they're elevating now aren't even very good looking. They're just there because they wanted a woman in this position, and then they'll advocate for stuff that's like completely stupid, and it's just all built around their own narrow self-interest. And it's like, well, I care about this, and my emotions say I care about this, and Republicans need to cater to me. Probably one of the worst examples is Jenna Ellis, who is like, Trump is losing my vote, and she's like, Jenna, this dumbass is testifying against Trump in court, and she is like, I can't believe Trump is losing the highly sought after testifying against Trump in trial demographic. But Jenna Ellis will always be like that. It's like, he's losing voters like me. And every woman is like that. And eventually just becomes a narrow focus. So in conclusion, I'm not that fond. I mean, you're going to have women in politics. You're going to have a lot of these commentators. They're a good way to propagandize views that people would otherwise not listen to. In that they are presented a good way to sell some of these more extreme or radical ideas. This was, I think, a benefit of a few people like Lauren Southern back in the mid 2010s to sell some of these ideas that if it was a man saying that, people are less inclined to listen. But if it's a woman, they'll be like, oh, okay, I'll listen. So that they do have they're going to be around, whether we like it or not. But I think you can't let them dominate the discourse and ensure what is allowed to be talked about and what we should talk about. Because generally, a lot of these women in conservative commentary would have very wrong ideas about what we should focus on. So I hope that answered some of this question. I don't think they're as much of a contributing factor to ICP outside of Boebert and MTG. And these women are not really winning back women voters. Boebert and MTG are just too clownish, and then a lot of these conservative commentators have a completely different ideas about how to win over young women. And generally, their ideas are a good way to ensure that Republicans are not winning over any college-educated women. Okay, and the second K-Max question, he said, Pat Casey was just a guest on Tim Pool's Culture War show on Friday. Do you feel this is a big sign of how mainstream right-wing figures no longer feel this fear of guilt by association? Tim Pool talks too much, and I'm sure you are on that show. Scott, the same might happen to you, but do you feel this is a huge change from 6 or 7 years ago? Would your goal on these shows be the perfect balancing of moving the Overton window, but in your most moderate way? A way not to scare Tim Pool, but also allows audience to hear new ideas. I don't know if I'd say it's a big sign, but there are increasing signs that the mainstream right will just allow certain people on their show. Some they won't allow on, some they will. It's also just dependent on whether you piss off people a lot. Like for me, a lot of conservatives, it's no longer for having me on their shows. It's no longer because what I did are my docs. It's because I attacked some ruralite that they really liked, or I'm a bugman, or I'm opposed to tattoos or something. It's always, or I criticize the NFL. That was a big reason. It's generally that these guys feel that I'm not playing with the team of the conservative entertainment complex and accepting my role. And I guess I'm a little bit more abrasive than some others with that. But they'll let others on who are come on. I mean, some of them they're just not going to let on because they feel that they're too controversial. But they're willing to, it's the bigger thing is that these commentators are more willing to entertain these ideas than they were ever before. And sometimes they'll have a figure who will articulate this on the show. Other times they're just gonna say this stuff themselves that they wouldn't say. And Tim Cass was not really a thing 6 or 7 years ago. I'm not sure what Tim Cass was doing 6 or 7 years ago. I think he was just like some random freelancer who was videotaping protests. And now Tim Cass is a massive show. And this is like a very much of the development of conservative media where it's outside of these institutions. It's just like one person with their own podcast and they're having a major influence on these ideas. And so they're more willing to allow on controversial people or people attacked by the SPLC than, say, Breitbart and Daily Caller and National Review were in the Trump era. Now they are, if you just have a big podcast and you're an independent creator and you're not, and maybe you're just on Rumble and you're not really on, maybe you're not as dependent on YouTube or you're just on Substack, you're able to interview and associate yourself or talk to these people that they would say you just can't talk to, you can't have any association with. I mean, if you just watch like Candace Owens and Charlie Kirk and what they discuss on the regular show, that is stuff that conservatives would have been fired and completely purged from for even alluding to 5 years ago. And now you see that they talk about this in every show. It's like, Candace Owens and Charlie Kirk, every time I see clips from it, it sounds like it's a alt-right podcast from 2016. The proper way to do that, if you're on Timcast, I don't really know. I didn't watch the show. So Tim Cass has his own little eccentricities and quirks he wants to emphasize on his show. You probably have to play to that too a little bit. I don't know if I would be, if I would have the temperament to play to that. But I think with what we're articulating now, we don't really have to play. We could just be open and honest with what we say because Charlie Kirk, Candace Owens, Matt Walsh, Tucker Carlson all say this stuff on their own shows. So you can just say what you believe and say it in an appropriate and proper manner, and I'm sure you'll be fine. I mean, it's a very different media environment now than when it was when I worked at the Daily Caller, and that's a positive development. So I have two more questions, or two people with questions. Fake Cell Eradicator is back, and he's got two questions he wants to ask. He said, on the topic of the wood chipper meme, instant public execution for pedos, rapists, are these people retarded? We will not say the word. I think I would be banned. Are these people not very smart? I get it that this is one of those edgelord approved topics for normies because pedos are still considered the most evil and taboo caste in our society. But do people realize how stupid modern juries are and how much women will lie out of spite? Imagine you end a relationship the wrong way with a single mom or some chick that has nieces and nephews, and then she claims you're a pedo and gets the kid to play along on the witness stand through her coaching and imprinting. The idiots on the jury would 100% convict solely based on witness testimony, weakest form of evidence, if they see some little kid cry. Not trying to be contrarian Hananian here and argue for pro-pedo, but I'm just trying to highlight how horribly wrong a stupid Reddit glowing eyes meme like that would turn out in practice. I think it's more... the thing is, it's very edgelord appropriate. It also just shows the right is they're definitely going to legalize pedophilia. It's absolutely not. It's the one taboo we have, and people cling to it because it's the one thing we're able to want to have mass extermination of pedophiles. That's totally appropriate. It is Reddit tier, and if it's Reddit tier, it's not going to be accepted in society. That's a good thing. Whenever I give this white pill, people get really upset. They're like, no, they're absolutely going to start allowing pedophiles everywhere. They're not. And I know there's examples of Google Gemini saying oh, pedophilia is... we can't condemn it that is so out of touch with public opinion, and the public gets extremely mad about pedophilia. And I think even the public is more anti-pedophilia now, or just any types of adult minor relationships now than it was in any time in my lifetime. And you have to realize is that all women, when like a 40-year-old guy dates a 25-year-old, they're like, that guy's a pedophile. When these teacher sex stories, which, I worked at the Caller, we used to always have these hilarious stories about them. When that comes up, now, even though, it's a huge cultural phenomenon in America to have fantasies about your teacher, hot for teacher like Van Halen. Now that is like pedophile, and we're going to throw these teachers in the wood chipper. And I even had this when Demi Moore, there's this clip of Demi Moore where she made out with some kid, she's like 19 or 18 and the kid's like 14, and she's making out with a kid, and everyone would be like, wow, that's a lucky kid. Now they're like, she needs to go in the wood chipper. She needs to go in the wood chipper. And so it's denying that there are real gender differences and just like a one-size-fits-all wood chipper for everyone. I don't know about the coaching. I think there probably is a few stories like that. Sometimes they defend the pedo. I mean, among Hispanics, there was a story about this like 12-year-old last year who went and got an abortion across state line. She crossed state lines to get an abortion, and the father was like likely the mother's boyfriend, and the mother was defending the boyfriend. So there's weird things like that that will happen. I think it is, but it's also what we consider pedophilia now as stuff that would have been considered statutory a few years ago, or it's these teacher sex stories that have just always happened and we always laughed at because we do view women and men as fundamentally different. Like a old teacher having sex with a young female student, we generally think that as a lopsided power dynamic, and we would view that as rape. But with the woman and the 16-year-old, the football player, we view that as hot for teacher. I mean, it is a crime, but we all laugh about it. It's like lucky kid, depending on how hot the teacher is. And it's just a funny story. But now it's all put them in the wood chipper. We have to have this idea. So it's like no real understanding of the differences that are happening between genders, and it's just a one-size-fits-all wood chipper that we deal with. But it's people cling to this because they want to have exhibit violence against figures that are viewed as evil, but the only figures that you're allowed to view as evil and want horrible deaths upon are pedos and racists. And so they would have a wood chipper meme for us. I mean, they had their own, it's like guillotine memes or, the stuff from Inglourious Bastards for racists, but for pedophiles, they have wood chippers. So it is what it is. It's never going to happen. That's another thing about the internet, is that people will just like puff out their chests and have no action behind it. So I wouldn't worry about it too much, but I think it is more dumb how the pedophile rhetoric, it encourages these bitter women to attack any man who dates a younger woman as a pedophile. And it encourages conservatives to be horrified by these teacher sex stories, which they're just like, they're crimes. They shouldn't do them. But, you laugh at it because you obviously understand there's a fundamental difference between men and women. But you're instead erasing that and having a blank slate libtard perception of sexual differences when you view them as just as evil pedophiles as a male teacher. So, moving along, his second question, when Trump wins the election, what will the lame duck session look like? I'm not talking about potential riots or Dems trying their own J6. They sort of screwed themselves with the Electoral Count Act they passed, but rather all the stuff that retiring Mitch McConnell and rhinos are going to pull as a middle finger to Trump on their way out. I'm sure the final omnibus will have unreviewable Ukraine aid for the next 10 years that can only be revoked with 3/4 majority, non-reportable status for DACA, make it impossible for Vivek to fire all those federal employees, etc. Basically preemptively hamstring everything for Project 25 5 playbook. I guess there will also be a bunch of funny stuff like Romney and Liz Cheney being awarded the Congressional Medal of Freedom. The only thing I really see that they would try to do in the lame duck would be Ukraine aid. But I don't know if they can even do that. They can't do shit right now. And I think if Trump's coming in, they would. I don't think it would be unreviewable Ukraine aid. I don't know how that would work. They would probably try to do something like that. But even I don't think Mitch McConnell and them want to give, unreviewable Ukraine aid for the next 10 years because they don't know what Ukraine aid might look like. Maybe they may think like, what if Russia takes over Ukraine and we're giving them aid? I don't know if that's what they would want. And I don't think they could get a 3/4 majority for something like that. They would definitely not get DACA amnesty. They can't. All those attempts have failed before. Most Republicans would not want to do this, and whoever the next majority leader is, unless it's Cornyn, would ensure that none of this shit that pisses off Trump would happen. So I don't think they would do much of anything in the lame duck session. They would probably try to do something on Ukraine, but they're even having trouble getting Ukraine funding right now. And if Trump was coming in, more Republicans, in order to have a good relationship with Trump, would be less inclined to that. So I don't think they would do much of wrong things. It would be a true lame duck session and that they would get very little done. The most you could see negative thing would be something on Ukraine. So that is it. Now we'll finish up with mystery. We usually used to start off with mystery, but from today, we're going to have mystery as our question. So he's talked about, hey, Scott, you've discussed how often we are not in a situation that closely parallels the antebellum South or Weimar. Is there a historical faction that you feel resembles our situation enough to be a meaningful role model? The 1920s conservative WASP dealing with replacement level immigration and leftist extremism seems close, but they had real establishment power. Cold War. Latin America has interesting parallels for a multi-ethnic and polarized society as well. And then he recommends some IQ supplement on Burnham and how I should talk about the changes that went on with the WASP, which I will definitely do at some point. Meaningful historical. I always like the 3rd century Rome. That's usually my go-to now because in 3rd century Rome had a lot of political chaos. Emperors getting murdered, coups, military mutinies, and all this stuff. I don't think we're going to have that much craziness, but at the same time, society just carried on. It was relatively safe, secure. They did have the Persians, the Parthians to worry about. The Parthians were beating them in battle, but it didn't really affect the empire to a great extent. Even though the Parthians captured and humiliated an emperor, the Roman Empire still carried along. And it was still very prosperous to live in that society, but it was not a very society you could be proud of or see yourself in the politics. It was a society where people were more retreating to their own things, and there was a development of all these religious cults. Christianity was one that developed and thrived at this time, and people were very much associated on the private sphere where there was a high degree of economic prosperity and a relative degree of security and stability with the empire. Meanwhile, the empire's leadership and the political sphere was turning into complete chaos. And I think that's like something to consider more of in America's state that we are in now. I don't know if 1920s is a very good example for a lot of different reasons. It's one, you did have that very assertive, WASP, Anglo-Protestant character of American society at that time. You had the immigrants, you really had a real Red Scare. All these immigrants coming in were left-wing radicals and committing terrorism. You're not quite having that. I mean, that could happen in the next decade or in a few years if Chauvinism, American Chauvinism emerges, but you don't really quite see that. You don't really have the WASP like they were at that time. Cold War Latin America, yeah, with their multi-ethnic but they don't have the degree of global power and prosperity we have. So Roman Empire, 3rd century, very politically depressing time, but they're still a world power and very prosperous while their political system is in chaos, and they're still able to carry on for those reasons. So that's probably the historical parallel I will look towards the most. But that is it for Highly Respected today. We are going to have more great content for the rest of this week, so be on the lookout for that. So until next time, stay respected.